Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Santa Cruz, California. A different decade and a different killer. Today we delve into the life and crimes of a sexually motivated psychopath who kept hikers in Northern California in a grip of fear for years in the early 1980s as he slunk in and out of foggy redwood forests on a brutal campaign of rape, terror, and murder. Brace yourself. Keep your hands and feet inside the ride and prepare for a wild, wild time as we bring you the story of David Joseph Carpenter, the dreaded Trailside Killer.
Let's begin. Prologue. Life after being the murder capital of the world. In the 1960s, Santa Cruz was a place of hope and promise, an idyllic and stunningly beautiful beach town surrounded by groves of ancient redwoods. There was a brand new college, and a youthful, liberal acceptance reigned. The new district attorney, Peter Chang, a musician of Asian descent, was the youngest DA in American history. But in 1970, all the hope and promise came crashing down when the family of Victor Ota, a prominent and successful eye surgeon, was slaughtered in their home by John Frazier, a psychotic hippie high on mescaline.
A family was literally slaughtered in their home by a drug-crazed hippie, sparking a cultural war between the conservative older generation and the new youth culture. And then, not one but two serial killers roamed the hills at the same time. Herbert Mullen and Edmund Kemper, littering the beautiful landscape with body parts and mutilated corpses.
After this, the sleepy beach town, previously famous for surfing and a boardwalk, became hardened, jaded. Folks didn't trust each other. The innocence had been shattered. But life went on, new students coming in, a sea of changing faces as older ones graduated and moved out. The boardwalk grew older and grungier every year, taking on an ominous feel. The culture itself changed, not just the culture of Santa Cruz and California, but the culture of the world. Disco bloomed briefly, then punk rock reared its ugly head, deeply impacting San Francisco to the north and trickling down to Santa Cruz. It went from roller skating to skateboards, and with the skateboard, a whole new culture emerged that defined Santa Cruz. Part punk, part surfer, but all delinquent.
The 70s saw the dramatic fall of an American president. Richard Nixon historically resigning in disgrace, Ford coming in to take his place and promptly pardoning him for all his crimes. And crime itself reached epidemic proportions. The serial killers that had plagued Santa Cruz and seemed so crazy, now just common occurrences across the country. The murder rate in California increased by 17%.
Still, life went on. And in many ways, though hardened, less innocent, Santa Cruz still remained an idyllic place brimming with counterculture. Stunningly beautiful, and as the 70s ended and the 80s began, some felt an optimistic hopefulness. As Ronald Reagan said, "It's morning again in America."
But was it? Because again, there was a killer loose in Santa Cruz.
On March 29, 1981, Santa Cruz Sheriff's Detective Stony Brook was called out to Henry Cowell Redwood Park. A young college student from Davis, Ellen Hansen, camping in the redwoods, had been shot 3 times, once execution style in the head. Her boyfriend had been shot in the neck, but survived. The killer was a stranger who'd slunk out of the redwoods, attempting to abduct the couple at gunpoint and threatening to rape the girl before killing her.
It was theorized that it could be the dreaded Trailside Killer, a mysterious figure who'd been killing hikers north of San Francisco in Marin County for years. Like a phantom, the killer would emerge from the shadows of the forest, often raping his victims before shooting them in the head, then slinking back into the wilderness and vanishing, leaving Marin County awash in fear.
But witnesses in Marin described the Trailside Killer as a young man in his 20s with black hair, thin and athletic, while witnesses in Santa Cruz described an older man, balding, who looked like an accountant, who was paunchy and disheveled and out of shape.
But when ballistic experts examined the .38 caliber bullet recovered from the head of Ellen Hansen, it matched perfectly with those from the Marin County killings. All the murders have been done with the same gun, confirming the Trailside Killer was in Santa Cruz. There was another serial killer at work in the murder capital of the world.
Fear and panic again bloomed in the seaside hamlet as Santa Cruz wondered who the Trailside Killer was. And in less than 3 months, after one of the wildest investigations you've ever heard, Detective Stony Brook would be placing handcuffs on a man named David Carpenter.
Chapter 1. Little David.
David Joseph Carpenter was born on May 6, 1930, at the Stanford Hospital in San Francisco, making him by far the oldest of the Santa Cruz serial killers.
1930 San Francisco. This is old school. This is the decade when both the Golden Gate Bridge and the Oakland Bay Bridge were built. Before that, you had to take a ferry to get to the city. Those bridges would bring a huge boom of population and employment and completely change the city.
David's father, Elwood, was a postal delivery driver with a drinking problem. His mother, Frances, a homemaker. Frances was said to be incredibly domineering and strong-willed, dictating how the family was to be run, inflexible and unwilling to compromise, which led to constant fights between her and Elwood, often leading to violence, and a home life that's been described as, quote, hellish.
In 1934, the troubled family had another child, a daughter named Anne, and this appears to be when the troubles with little David began.
This is in many ways just a very, very sad story. David was left-handed, which both his mother and his teachers tried to cease by forcing him to use his right hand, which he hated and rebelliously fought against. Frances would try to nip this rebellious streak in the bud by beating him, often leaving bruises on the little boy. David also had very bad eyesight, requiring thick bifocal glasses. David was also a chronic bedwetter, which his mother tried to beat out of him. And he would be long into his teens.
But the thing that his parents despised about him most was his stutter. From a very young age, David developed a heavy stutter, which was always worsened by any kind of stress. This stutter would sadly come to define him.
David's mother, Frances, had old-fashioned tastes, even for the 1930s, and she insisted David wear his hair in feminine curly locks, which she hand-trimmed herself, and dressed David in what was known as a Little Lord Fauntleroy suits.
The classic Fauntleroy suit was a velvet cutaway jacket with matching knee pants, worn with a fancy blouse and a large lace or ruffled collar. They were popular in the 1890s, but were completely out of style by the rough and tumble 1930s, when kids were dressing like little gangsters and early greasers.
To put it in perspective, Everyone's seen that movie, A Christmas Story, right? He'd be that exact age. Imagine those kids and that mean bully. And along comes a kid with his hair in coiffed curls, in velvet knee pants, and a silk blouse with an ornate ruffled collar.
It had to be rough. And also, Francis insisted he learn the violin. So David would be trudging a violin case under one arm and pushing his thick bifocal glasses up and stuttering so badly he could hardly speak. It's really sad.
As one of the neighborhood kids said,
Yeah, they always dressed him up like some fancy pants, and the kids on the block were always pounding the hell out of him, partly because he got good grades and was smart as a whip.
David went to Glen Park Elementary School and was teased and bullied mercilessly, to the point where his mother forbade him from playing with the neighborhood children. She also demanded he take ballet classes, which he hated and deeply resented, and would bring up as an adult 4 decades later as a source of anger when being interviewed by police.
And any perceived infraction by the little boy was met with a thrashing. Family friends recall a camping trip where David broke a bottle of milk and Francis flew into a rage, grabbing a belt and beating him mercilessly. Sadly, this was relatively normal at that time. In his 4th grade yearbook, you can clearly see that David has a black eye.
As another neighborhood kid recalls,
after the neighborhood kids would get through punching him, his parents would take over. Can you imagine getting a beating because you went camping and came home with dirt on your pants?
And Elwood and Francis fought constantly and often over little David, arguing about what should be done about his stutter, which for some reason Francis refused to directly work on.
It's strange. She insisted he study ballet and violin, wear these goofy velvet suits, and have longish hair, but she wouldn't take him to see a speech therapist. I don't know if she couldn't face it or was hoping it would just go away, but she'd make appointments, then take him to the clinic. But when they got to the front door, she would suddenly change her mind and leave.
And the truth is that many people have grown up with stutters. Marilyn Monroe stuttered as a child, as did James Earl Jones, who became famous as the voice of Darth Vader. And David was a highly intelligent child who at first did well in school. But as the years of abuse piled on, he became more and more distant, as well as strange and cruel. As one of his elementary school teachers said, "I tried and tried, and I just couldn't get through to him."
He began to become abusive to animals, loved pulling the wings and legs off of large flies, delighting in their struggle and pain. And now, failing in school, a social pariah, a source of family shame, beaten mercilessly for any perceived infraction. By the 9th grade, David couldn't take it any longer and ran away from home, heading south and into the Santa Cruz Mountains, where there was a family cabin in the redwoods, where he would sit in the dark forest, stewing. The redwoods would become a place he'd constantly go to, hiding out in the wilderness like some type of monster, shunned from society. He'd break into cabins and homes, stealing food to survive.
Because of his truancy, he was expelled from high school and would never return again.
And then David's sex drive kicked in. Something that he said was so overwhelmingly powerful, it would completely dominate his life, his every thought, the very nature of his being, something uncontrollable. And like so many of these killers we see, his mind became a confused jumble of anger, resentment, violence, simmering rage, and sex. He learned to equate sex with violence, force, dominance, and humiliation.
At just 14 years old, David Carpenter encountered 2 of his cousins, an 8-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl at Diamond Heights Park, and led them to a public bathroom where he brandished a knife and told them,
"My dog will bite you if you don't do what I say."
He was sent to the Napa State Hospital for sex offenses. He would be arrested 4 more times for sex charges, and at 17 was sentenced to the California Youth Authority Facility in Preston, California. He was paroled in December of 1948. Fellow inmates say he would brag, saying,
"By the time I was 18, I had intercourse 50 times, sometimes with consent, but most often by force."
David got a job driving a truck and doing messenger service around the piers and docks of San Francisco for the H.B. Thomas Company on Battery Street, but was soon in trouble again when he attempted to rape a 17-year-old girl who managed to fight him off, lock herself in a bathroom, and climb out the window.
Though he was acquitted for this attempted sexual assault, he didn't deny the facts. A psychological report was drawn up on him that reads,
Carpenter is a mentally disordered sex offender. During moments of extreme stress, sexual urges often reach such a point that they become an overwhelming impulse. Whenever Carpenter feels hemmed in, his sexual urge climbs, and the only way he can think straight is to rape the nearest female. He is a very bright man who has many capabilities, and he is not a professional criminal. It would seem worth the state's time and money to try an effective rehabilitation approach for him. That seems a little suspect to me. How do you say he's not a professional criminal when he can't function unless he rapes the nearest female? Well, a little bit faulty logic there.
Totally, it's totally fucked up shit. Rape was just not seen as a big deal in the old days. And often, fucked up, sadly, the women were blamed. And so many serial killers start as rapists. Joseph D'Angelo immediately comes to mind. And many of his early victims talk about how their rapes just weren't taken seriously. And to say he's not a professional criminal, he was literally living off of breaking into people's homes.
Yeah, it's wild. So the report stated that David was acting out the ego of his mother, stating that his overbearing mother, who often beat him, hated women, and therefore so did Carpenter, who saw himself as a victim of women. And all his actions stemmed from the fact that women were to blame.
Here's something very interesting. Whenever David Carpenter committed sexual assaults, his stutter completely disappeared. This would later make it very difficult for police when victims would say the perpetrators spoke clearly without any impediment whatsoever. Also, when David Carpenter spoke clearly, it was when he was at his most dangerous and ruthless.
David became friendly with a girl named Wilhelmina from Daly City, but when he expressed his amorous desires to her, she rebuffed his advances. At first, he began to badmouth her and spread rumors about the girl, but then he set his sights on her little sister, Ellen May.
David was somehow able to woo little Ellen May, and on November 5th, 1955, at 25 years old, David married 19-year-old Ellen May.
Within a year, their first child was born, Michael David, soon followed by another son, Gabriel.
David's wife would later say his sex drive dominated his life, was abnormally strong, and made life a nightmare. He demanded sex 3 times a night, every single night, or there would be violent outbursts. She said he would fly into terrifying rages, and they'd be unable to communicate because his stutter would become so bad he couldn't speak.
David worked for a while as a purser, or head steward on a passenger ship for the Pacific Far East Lines, where he creeped out passengers so badly they'd remember him for decades. But he worked his way up from purser to clerk and was soon assistant to the vice president. He was quite conniving and manipulative, as most psychopaths are.
An efficiency report from the Times stated,
He had no difficulty getting along with other people, other than his terrific temper due to his speech difficulty whenever he had to handle public relations at the company.
David and Ellen then had their 3rd child, a daughter named Circe Ann.
Chapter 2. Lois. Lois DeAndrade was a secretary for Foot, Cone, and Belding, an advertising agency that worked with Pacific Far East lines. David became infatuated and utterly obsessed with the woman. He'd had coffee with her a few times and even invited her to his house to meet his wife and have dinner, making her a friend of the family of sorts.
He also stalked her, as many of these men do, hunting her, learning her routine. And on July 12th, 1960, at 8 o'clock in the morning, David was circling the block where she lived, waiting for her to go to the bus stop, like she did every day for her commute to work.
When David saw Lois at the bus stop, he pulled up and offered to give her a ride, then insisted they swing by his place and see his new baby, saying he and his wife were now living on the nearby Presidio military base, the oldest active military installation in the United States, which was a lie.
David drove into the Presidio, pretending to get lost. But as he drove, his speech became clearer, stronger, and as Lois began complaining that she was going to be late for work, David lost all traces of a stammer or stutter.
David drove them on Lincoln Boulevard past the military cemetery, then under the Highway 101 overpass where the trees grew heavier, and down an isolated street by a secluded beach, the Golden Gate Bridge stretching out in the fog-dappled distance.
When David pulled the car to a stop, he was silent with a strange look in his eye, and Lois, panicking, began to get out of the car and run. But David leapt out right behind her, grabbing her and throwing her back into the car while screaming, "What's the matter? Where are you going?"
He straddled her in the large front seat and opened the glove box, where he had a rope and a knife, placing the knife against her neck and telling her he'd kill her if she made a noise.
Lois looked up at him pleadingly, saying,
"David, what's the matter with you? You're my friend."
David replied back coldly, not a hint of a stutter, "I have this funny quirk that's got to be satisfied."
David then reached under the seat and pulled out a hammer. As he raised the hammer poised to strike, Lois went berserk. She kicked at him, screaming, and reached out to the steering wheel and began honking the horn.
David then came at her with the knife, thrusting it at her, but she was able to grab it and deflect the blow, the blade slicing into her fingers and lacerating the tendons.
Throwing herself at the driver's side door, Lois managed to open it and tumbled out onto the street in her high heels, and she went racing off, David Carpenter right behind her with the hammer.
From the corner of her eye, Lois could see the hammer coming towards her head and raised an arm to deflect the blow, the hammer crashing down onto her watch and smashing it. But the second blow caught her in the temple, and she screamed desperately for help as she tumbled to the ground.
Miraculously, those cries for help would be heard by a military policeman driving a block away, who raced toward the shouts, leaping from his car, riot baton in one hand, the other hand on his holstered .45.
As Officer Hicks came upon the struggle, he saw David pounding Lois in the head with the hammer and hollered for him to stop. But David continued striking Lois over and over as the officer came running up.
As Officer Hicks reached David, raising his baton to strike him, David leapt off of Lois, dodged the baton, and managed to hit the officer with the hammer before ducking around the car. The officer drew his gun and told David to drop the hammer, which he did, raising his hands, appearing to comply. And then, this is just absolutely insane, David withdrew a fountain pen gun contraption, firing at the officer.
Yeah, it was some kind of a homemade gas gun designed to look like a fountain pen that fired a .38 caliber bullet. And he shoots it point blank at the officer, the bullet just missing the officer's head. But this burst of hot white smoke came out and burned the officer's face and eyes. So David was able to start running and made it a good distance away before the officer recovered enough to pull out his gun and start popping off rounds at David with his service revolver. David is darting and ducking, headed into the trees, and the first 2 shots miss him, but the next 2 shots find their target, striking David in the abdomen, and he falls to the ground screaming, "You got me! You got me! Stop shooting!"
The officer then handcuffs David and puts him in the back of his car, then goes to Lois, who's in really bad shape. The policeman saying he could actually see where her skull was fractured, and puts her in the back of the car as well to drive her to the hospital. And she's freaking out, going, "No, don't put me in there with him."
What a crazy scene, man. And David saying to Lois, "It's okay. I won't hurt you anymore. I can't hurt you."
Lois's skull was broken in 2 places. She required immediate brain surgery. Portions of her skull had to be removed and replaced with tantalum plates. Miraculously, her brain injuries were not permanent, but sadly, the tendons in her hand were unable to be repaired, and she lost use of her fingers.
David was charged with assault with intent to commit murder, and because it occurred on a military base, it was a federal charge. He was sentenced to 14 years at the U.S. Penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington.
His wife promptly divorced him.
Good. He'd served 9 years, the minimum sentence, and was paroled on April 7th, 1969. And once free, he would go completely crazy, just unhinged and out of control like a rabid animal.
Chapter 3: The Crime Spree from Hell. Once released from prison, David moved in with his stepbrother and began studying welding. He attended group therapy classes where he met a woman named Helen who'd been recently divorced, and they began dating. Within a few short months, David asked her to marry him, and she accepted.
On August 8th, Helen and David got married, and David moved into her apartment on Sutter Street. In the beginning of January 1970, Helen took a trip to Hawaii, leaving David behind.
And David, brimming with fantasies of rape and violence, heard the call of Santa Cruz and headed south to the little resort town.
This would have been 10 months before the Ota family massacre committed by John Lindley Frazier. So while Carpenter is the last of the Santa Cruz madmen we are covering, he was actually the first to stalk the idyllic beach community hunting victims.
David drove down to Santa Cruz in his 1965 Volkswagen Beetle, also the favorite car of Ted Bundy. His sexually deviant impulses at a fever pitch. Driving along Highway 280, he saw an attractive woman drive by, so he turned around and began to follow her, aggressively tailgating her, forcing her car off the road and into a ditch. The woman sprang from her vehicle and ran into the forest. David gave chase but lost her and returned to his car, driving off in search of other prey.
So fucking scary, man. It was 10:15 at night when David came upon 19-year-old Cheryl Lynn Smith driving through the redwoods by Boulder Creek. Again, just as he'd done earlier, he began tailgating her, this time actually slamming into the back of her car, causing her to veer off the road.
David grabbed his knife and slowly approached the teenager whose car was now stuck on the side of the road. The teenager, angry and upset, began yelling at the bald older man with the crooked teeth. "Why did you crash into me? Are you drunk?"
David coldly told her, without a hint of a stutter, "I want to rape you. I'll have to kill you if you don't come with me."
David Carpenter then grabbed the girl and dragged her up the hillside, through brambles and into the dark redwood forest, ripping and cutting her clothes off as the girl fought against him, slicing her legs and arms, severing the muscles in her right arm. But Cheryl managed to break free and make it back to the road, where David grabbed her and suddenly became kind and sweet, his stutter returning as he absurdly offered to bandage her up and help her.
She refused his offer and got back into her car and sped off.
David drove back to San Francisco, his depraved and violent mission a failure, knowing he'd soon be in trouble as the girl had seen his license plate. As he packed a bag with a few clothes, a hunting knife, flashlight, and electrical cord, he soon heard a banging on the front door, the San Francisco police demanding he open it.
David, sly as a fox, was able to duck out the back door unnoticed, and he walked all the way to Daly City, where he slept in an abandoned house, and then hitchhiked back to Santa Cruz.
Like both John Fraser and Herbert Mullen, David Carpenter crept through the redwood hills of Santa Cruz. In fact, this is crazy. At this point, January of 1970, all three of them were probably out there in the depths of the Santa Cruz Mountains at the exact same time, ticking time bombs, none of whom had murdered yet, but each well on their way.
So fucking crazy. David came upon a little house in the forest and broke in, like he's Goldilocks or something, rummaging through the family's belongings, changing into their clothes, and putting on a bathrobe he found, also finding a 16-gauge shotgun.
David was sitting there calmly in an easy chair, wearing a bathrobe, the shotgun sitting across his legs, when the owner, a local school teacher named Wilma McDonald, returned home with her two young sons.
David took the family hostage. He sent the boys to their bedrooms, then took Wilma at gunpoint, forcing her to drive him in her Mercedes to the cabin that had once been in his parents' family, out by Henry Cowell Redwood State Park. There, he raped her, and then completely changed demeanor, like he was a completely different person. He started stuttering and apologizing, and then drove her back to her home, telling her, I'm sick. I need help. I'm lonely.
David then drove off in Wilma's Mercedes, driving all night, wandering about, ending up in Daly City at 8 a.m, and attempting to kidnap 25-year-old Sharon O'Donnell in the parking garage of her apartment complex. She managed to run off, so David then stole her car, this time driving way out to the incredibly isolated and secluded forests of Calaveras County, County of Skulls, which you may remember from our episode on Leonard Lake and Charles Ng.
Out in the tall pines and Sierra foothills of Calaveras, David hid in the forest for days, until February 3rd, when he crept up to a house and knocked on the back door, brandishing a long-barreled pistol at the cleaning woman who answered, Lucille Deus. He tied her to a bed, robbed her, and stole her car. To this day, no one knows where he got that pistol. Most likely he stole it from a house he burgled while hiding in the woods.
David then drove to Angel's Camp, home of the frog jumping contest made famous by Mark Twain and legendary Grateful Dead concerts. Again knocking on the back door of a random house where he abducted a young mother and her infant son, demanding she drive him out to a secluded campsite where he raped her before changing clothes and getting back in the car. Now suddenly happy and chipper, apologetic, playing with the infant, bouncing him on his knee.
Dude, that is so terrifying, bouncing the kid on his knee, man. Fuck.
He then had the young mother pull over and drop him off on the side of the road where he disappeared back into the forest. She'd later say, I remember him as quite kind. He was especially gentle with my baby.
What the fuck, man? Oh, shit. I guess that's just some serious Stockholm syndrome shit going on there. I don't know. David then hitchhikes to Modesto and goes to the Greyhound bus station, where Stanislaus County deputies recognized him. He's pretty easy to spot, the bald guy with the thick glasses, crooked teeth, and terrible stutter.
He was taken to the Calaveras County Jail to await trial. On Monday, April 27, 1970, He cuts through his cell bars and climbs out a skylight with a few other inmates, then vaults the fence and takes off into the woods. Once free, he tells the other inmates he was the Zodiac Killer.
And apparently, he was an actual suspect in the Zodiac case for a hot minute. But, who wasn't?
And soon bloodhounds were on the outlaw's trail, and they were all rounded up and sent back to jail.
What a crazy crime spree. This guy is a total fucking unhinged madman. Complete sociopath maniac, just running rampant. And all this while his brand new wife is on vacation in Hawaii. Boy, she was in for a surprise when she got home.
He was charged with 2 counts of armed robbery, 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of auto theft, and prison escape. He was sentenced to 5 years to life on the first 2 counts, and 1 year to 25 on the others to run consecutively, the judge saying,
I believe this man is extremely dangerous and that he should be incarcerated for a substantial period of time. No shit, really?
Chapter 4. Prison. On June 17, 1970, David Carpenter was sent to Folsom Prison, but in October of 1972, he was transferred to the Vacaville, California Medical Facility, which, if you remember last week, was called Disneyland North by convicts, and where Edmund Kemper and Charlie Manson would do time.
Yeah, and there was a moment there in the mid-70s when all 3 of these guys, Edmund Kemper, Charlie Manson, and David Carpenter, would have been there at the same time. When in Vacaville, David was a model prisoner, doing all his assigned work and not presenting any disciplinary problems. He took college courses in finance, mathematics, accounting, and philosophy, receiving all A's. He learned to weld and work sheet metal, and took group therapy sessions.
In 1977, he was paroled from Vacaville, but still had to serve 2.5 years in federal prison for violating the terms of his 1960 assault conviction. In Lompoc Federal Penitentiary, he developed a tight circle of friends, including a guy nicknamed the Greek and a young bank robber named Shane Williams, who somehow considered David a mentor. Remember that name, Shane Williams, because he will be coming back to the story. A crazy, crazy character.
David started a correspondence with a Santa Rosa woman named Molly Jo Purnell, whose husband, an ex-con, had recently committed suicide. She was one of those lonely women who write to prisoners, and Molly and David became pen pals, and the letters became so intimate that at one point he even asked her to marry him. He also asked her if he could have some packages mailed to her that he'd pick up when he was released.
On May 21, 1979, David was released on parole from the Lompoc Penitentiary and sent to a halfway house for federal prisoners in San Francisco called Reality House West, in the infamous Tenderloin District.
David's estranged daughter was working nearby at a car dealership, and David went and introduced himself, saying, "Hi, I'm your dad," and giving her a box of candy. It was the first time she'd ever laid eyes on him.
David went to a speech therapist who taught him to speak slowly and rhythmically, which greatly helped with his stutter. He also tried marijuana, hoping it might help. He says it didn't help him with his stutter, but smoking it made him not care that he stuttered.
David was placed in training for computer printing at the California Trade School in Hayward, and his instructor was warned by his parole officer that he should not be working around women, and was assured that David would just be sitting in a room by himself typing. But that's not how it went down. There were plenty of women students, and he was soon involved with a woman named Nancy Morrison, who was on federal parole for a narcotics conviction. David would pay her for sex, and she described him as a, quote,
horny old man who was turned on by young women.
David also finally met his pen pal Molly, who was not impressed with the bald, stuttering man in the thick glasses and basically blew him off. But she did give him the packages he'd asked to have sent to her, one of which contained a .44 caliber bulldog pistol.
David then joined the Sierra Club, having always loved hiking and the outdoors, in his disturbing and twisted way, and began spending time on Mount Tamalpais in neighboring Marin County, just north of San Francisco.
Chapter 5: The Sleeping Lady. Mount Tamalpais, often referred to as the Sleeping Lady, or Mount Tam by locals, is the tallest peak in Marin County, towering above the Golden Gate, where ships enter into the San Francisco Bay. It is a beloved place for nature enthusiasts, with its extensive network of hiking and biking trails, winding through redwood groves, grassy meadows, and chaparral-covered slopes, from which, on a clear day, you can see the Golden Gate Bridge and the skyline of San Francisco.
The native Miwok peoples revered it as a holy place, but also one of abduction and death, saying after the creation of the world, a sun god fell in love with a lovely maiden, and swooping her up in his arms to carry her to the sky, he stumbled over Mount Diablo, and the woman fell from his grasp and to her death. Where the sun god fell, creating a huge pit, became the bay, and the mountain became the shape of the maiden, hence the name the Sleeping Lady.
Etta Kane was a married 44-year-old Bank of America executive living in Mill Valley. She was an avid hiker who loved hiking on the Sleeping Lady. On August 9th, 1979, Ada went for a hike and never returned home.
Her husband, who was 20 years her senior and suffering from arthritis, began to panic when she didn't come home and drove out to the nature reserve to look for her, but could find no sign of his wife. He alerted police, and in the morning a massive search was underfoot for the missing hiker, who was presumed lost.
But she wasn't lost. Etta Kane was found naked, wearing only one sock, in a kneeling position, shot in the back of the head.
It was the first murder ever to occur on Mount Tamalpais and sent shockwaves through the community. Marin County was where people went to escape the violence and crime of San Francisco. It was considered a wholesome and safe place. Unfortunately, this was only the first of what would become a string of murders, associated with a mysterious and shadowy predator that would become known as the Trailside Killer.
Sadly, it appears that David Carpenter had learned something from his years of incarceration. Never leave a witness alive. He'd only been released from prison for less than 3 months.
Chapter 6: Discharged.
On Thursday, September 6, 1979, David Carpenter was discharged from the halfway house. His counselor saying,
He made great strides in his rehabilitation and was a good risk to be returned to society. Mr. Carpenter's days of criminality appear to be over.
David then moved in with his parents at 38 Sussex Street in San Francisco. His parents were elderly now, his mother legally blind, but his father still drank heavily and was quick with violence, often beating his blind wife.
David got himself a dog named Herman, using the little furry beast as a conversation starter as he walked it about the neighborhood.
On October 21st, 1979, Mary Frances Bennett, 23, was jogging in Lincoln Park near Land's End in San Francisco when she was attacked and stabbed 25 times and buried in a shallow grave. That same day, David Carpenter was treated in the emergency room of Marin General for a deep cut on his left thumb and various lacerations with dirt ground in them. He claimed he was bitten by a dog while hiking.
It wouldn't be until 2010 that DNA evidence linked David Carpenter to this horrible and brutal murder, which begs the question, how many more victims are out there that we don't know about? There are many disappearances and murders that are now believed to have been committed by this monster.
In February, David finished his printing course and found a job with a family friend who owned a trinket manufacturing factory called Gems of the Golden West that mostly made keychains. Carpenter started work in the keychain warehouse as a handyman, delivery driver, and factory worker. His parole officer warned his new employer that he should not work with women, and they completely ignored him. In fact, nearly all of his coworkers were women.
Chapter 7. Barbara. Over a year after the murder of Etta Kane, Barbara Schwartz, 23, an organic bread maker who'd recently moved to the Bay Area from Baltimore, was living in a cabin by Muir Beach and loved to go hiking with her dog. And one of her favorite places to hike was the Sleeping Lady.
On Saturday, March 8th, 1980, Barbara was hiking on the slopes of Mount Tam, through the grassy meadows and into a grove of redwoods. At around 5:30, a woman named Jan Christie was hiking in the same place when she noticed, down below her through the trees, Barbara sitting on a rock amongst the redwoods, resting and playing with her dog. And to her horror, she watched as a man came creeping up behind her, raised a knife, and began to stab Barbara over and over as her dog went wild, barking. Jan, in an incredibly brave move, then ran towards them, waving her arms and screaming, "Stop, stop, stop!"
The man then fled, disappearing into the shadows and fog. But unfortunately, Barbara's wounds were fatal, and she lay there dead, her dog standing protectively over her lifeless body.
Jan went screaming for help, and when park rangers and sheriff's deputies arrived, Barbara's dog wouldn't let them near the body, and they had to coax the poor canine away. In the brush, investigators found a pair of blood-spattered, heavy black bifocal glasses that were traced back to the California prison system. But that was as far as they were able to get. The vast network of California prison systems was unable to say for whom the glasses were made, so authorities sent flyers out to optometrists in the area, detailing the unique prescription: bifocals with one eye, much worse than the other.
This is long before the internet, and many eye doctors either didn't get the flyer or didn't pay any attention to it. In a cruel twist of irony, David Carpenter actually went to Barbara's own optometrist to get a replacement pair of glasses, and somehow her own eye doctor had not received the flyer or had paid it no heed.
Days later, children hiking near the area discovered a blood-covered knife in the leaves. Knowing not to touch the knife and contaminate the murder weapon, they left it where it lay and ran looking for help, and came across a news crew reporting on the crime. The children led the news crew to the knife, and the newscaster promptly went and picked up the knife by the handle, obliterating the fingerprints that would have led them to David Carpenter.
Ugh, what an idiot. Jan, who'd been some distance away and really only saw silhouettes in the dappled light from the towering redwoods, described a tall, thin, white male with black hair, around 24 years old. Of course, David Carpenter was a paunchy bald man in his 50s.
It's believed David was wearing a dark wool knit cap at the time of the attack, which he often did. And that's what made her think she saw a full head of black hair.
The once peaceful and serene sleeping lady was now the site of 2 murders. Investigators wondered if they could be connected, but they had their doubts. One was committed with a gun, the other with a knife. Most likely they were random and unrelated. Still, they wondered.
Meanwhile, David was still visiting his old pen pal Molly, and in January she loaned him a .22 caliber Ruger revolver, which he said he needed for target practice, though he refused to take her along to the firing range.
2 weeks later, David told Molly the gun had been stolen and paid her $200 to replace it. Later, he also convinced her to buy him a .38 caliber Rossi revolver from a sporting goods store, putting the weapon in her name. This .38 would become David's weapon of choice.
Chapter 8. Anne. Anne Alderson was 26 years old, an animal scientist who'd grown up in Marin County and was in the Peace Corps. On October 13th, 1979, she had been visiting her grandmother in the hospital when she decided to take a detour to old Mount Tam for a short hike, walking through the redwoods into the stone amphitheater.
She sat on the stone seats of the amphitheater where Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream was often performed, as it was the perfect place to invoke woodland fairies surrounded by majestic trees with a stunning view. Anne sat facing the setting sun, meditating, legs crossed.
She was seen by a jogger who thought she looked particularly vulnerable there, alone, with her eyes shut, and the jogger thought of telling the young woman about the murders, warning her to be aware, but then thought better of it, as he didn't want to disturb her in her deep meditation.
Anne then vanished and was never seen alive again.
After an extensive 2-day search through the wilderness, her body was discovered a quarter-mile away from the amphitheater, shot in the head, just a half-mile from where Etta Kane was murdered.
Anne was completely clothed when discovered, but investigators determined she'd been stripped, sexually assaulted, and then redressed.
An autopsy showed that this murder was done with a .38 caliber pistol, as opposed to Etta Kane, who'd been killed with a .44 caliber. 2 different guns, but the circumstances were too similar. Investigators came to believe there was a killer on Mount Tamalpais, experimenting with methods of murder. The .44 had been too loud, drew too much attention, so the killer tried a knife, which didn't work out, so he switched to a .38, which was much quieter.
They were absolutely right, and the Trailside Killer had found his preferred weapon.
And Mount Tam, being the heart of the Bay Area and right over the bridge from old San Francisco, covens of witches began to gather to put a hex on the killer and clear the negative energy. As Susanna Budapest says,
"We found leaflets tacked on the redwoods that said, quote, 'Women stay away from here because there is a murderer stalking,' end quote. We felt that was the wrong idea. He should go and the women should stay. So from the sites where he did the killing, we gathered earth in a brown bag. We made a voodoo doll. We put in herbs, nettle, which stings, mandrake, rosemary. A very good witch in San Francisco made an oil, a double-crossing oil, pretty heavy stuff. And we named him Whosoever Kills on Mount Tamalpais, and we had Mother Nature there. She saw it. Around in the mud, we danced widdershins. We screamed and became the Furies. We asked the earth to give him up. We asked the animals to give him up. We asked all living beings to turn him away, to give him out, to betray him, and there would be no way to hide, and that his life would be gone. A woman will turn him in. That's the goddess's touch."
Chapter 9, Point Reyes. Point Reyes is a peninsula jutting 12 miles out into the Pacific Ocean, 48 miles north of San Francisco. With the billowing fog and rocks, it is considered one of the most hazardous sections of the Pacific coast, a graveyard of ships. Before the lighthouse was put in, there were over 100 shipwrecks on its craggy coast.
The Point Reyes National Seashore is 70,000 acres and beloved by hikers and nature enthusiasts.
Diane McConnell had just graduated from college from prestigious Stanford, and on November 28, 1980, she and 3 friends decided to take a day hike in Point Reyes.
The trails are extremely thin and winding, so they had to go single file. And as the 3 friends hiked, they grew separated, walking at their own pace, enjoying the solitude and peacefulness of nature, eventually growing about 100 yards apart from one another as they hiked the narrow switchbacks of the Sky Trail.
Diane was in the middle, but when her friends reached the trailhead where they were to meet, Diane wasn't there, though she should have been, being the second person in line. So her friends went back looking for her, but she was nowhere to be seen. She'd vanished. At 5 p.m., after searching and searching, they finally reported her missing to the park rangers.
Also hiking that day was a 25-year-old woman named Shauna May, who'd been going in the opposite direction as Diane and her friends. Shauna, too, was going to meet a friend at a trailhead, and Shauna, too, did not show up. Now there's a search on for 2 missing women.
A 50-person search and rescue team went into effect, all out there searching desperately for the missing hikers who were believed to have gotten lost in the rugged wilderness, which isn't uncommon in the remote, deep forest.
In the morning, 50 yards off the trail, a park ranger made a horrific discovery. 2 badly decomposed human bodies.
Only they weren't Diane and Shauna. These bodies had been there for a long time, and they were a man and a woman, namely 18-year-old Cynthia Moreland and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Richard Stowers. Their families had reported them missing 6 weeks earlier, but authorities assumed the 2 had run off together. Richard was in the Coast Guard, who had reported Richard as AWOL and released a warrant for his arrest.
Further down the trail, the bodies of Shauna and Diane were found naked, side by side, face down, their clothes in a little pile.
Diane had been strangled with a wire, most likely while Shauna was forced to watch. Shauna was then raped and shot in the head. The killer then shot Diane in the head as well to ensure she was dead. It's theorized that while David was abducting Diane, Shauna just stumbled upon them and became a victim as well.
4 bodies on the same trail, all murdered with the same .38, which had been used on Ann Alderson on Mount Tam, bringing the count up to 7.
Marin County went into a total panic. There was a serial killer loose on their hiking trails.
Chapter 10. The Trailside Killer. While rangers posted signs warning people against hiking in Marin and pleaded with people to never hike alone, David Carpenter was living his pathetic life in San Francisco, most likely having a laugh at the suspect drawings circling around that looked nothing like him at all.
And David had fallen head over heels in love. He met a girl named Candy, telling friends she was the first woman he knew who had as strong a sex drive as him, a regular nymphomaniac. And as we all know, 2 people who have nothing in common but a strong sex drive are bound to have a stable, long-term, and fulfilling relationship. Now tell me this isn't the greatest meet-cute in history. Here's how David and Candy met and fell in love. So sweet.
David was on his way to see his parole officer when he saw a woman on the side of the road at the intersection of Golden Gate and Van Ness, sitting on the curb beside her broken-down car, which had the hood up. So he pulls over, offers her help, and arranges to get her car towed to a shop for her. Her name was Candace Dawn Townsend, and she was just passing through San Francisco, driving up from Los Angeles to visit friends in Guerneville, up in Sonoma County.
She had 2 black eyes, which David said drew him to her. That's what gets him going, I guess, a woman with 2 black eyes. Well, he then asks her if she wants to take a drive with him, and she accepts.
He takes her out over the Golden Gate Bridge into Marin and right to Mount Tam. Then, Candy would say, he completely stopped stuttering, began talking easily and steadily, not even a murmur to his voice.
Which, as we know, means he's about to rape and kill her. But to David's surprise, she was suddenly all over him. And the next thing you know, they were in the back seat just going at it. And Candy fucked David silly. He'd never met anyone like that before. And she also, unknowingly, saved her own life in doing so.
David was so smitten with Candy that within hours of meeting her, he asks her to move in with him, and she accepts. She moves in, and remember, David's living with his elderly parents. His mother is now legally blind, and his dad's a violent drunk.
So Candy moves in, and it's like the weirdest sitcom you can imagine in this household. The elderly, bossy mother who is now blind, the violent, drunk father, their son, the stuttering serial killer, and his new girlfriend, the nymphomaniac.
That's, if it weren't so disturbing, it would be hilarious.
It's still kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Candy gets a job at the local bar as a bartender, and soon David asks her to marry him. She says yes. Yay, they're engaged. See, anyone can find love. Anyone, because David Carpenter was a disgusting, cruel, ugly, selfish, myopic, bald, and stuttering monster of a man. And he found Candy.
What a meet cute. And David also got a new job at Econo Quick Print down in San Jose, using the training he'd received after prison. It was a good job, and he was excelling, doing great. Life was just going honky-dory for the Trailside Killer.
Just like the trade school, and just like at Gems of the Golden West, his parole officer wrote the company a letter saying David should not be working with women. And just like all the others, they completely ignored it, which eventually leads to a horrible, horrible tragedy.
David telling his old man that his Chevy was burning up gas driving all the way down to San Jose from San Francisco every day, got his dad to loan him $1,000 and bought a red 1974 Fiat 124 sedan. But he rarely drove the car, and oddly, never told his parole officer about it, didn't tell anyone about it, and kept it hidden in a back lot at the Econo Quick Print in San Jose. It was almost as if the car were a secret.
FBI profiler John Douglas came to Marin to help with the newly formed Trailside Killer Task Force, and after investigating the crimes, drew up a psychological profile of the killer. He believed it was a white male who had cripplingly low self-esteem and theorized it may come from some personal issue, most likely a stutter.
Damn, a stutter. How did he come up with that? He's so good. Perhaps the killings themselves show a kind of stutter. You know, there's a gun, then a knife, then a different gun, and also strangulation with a wire. I don't know. John Douglas is amazing to come up with that.
Hey folks, looking for that perfect morning pick-me-up, but still want to keep it spooky? Try Paranormal Coffee with 9 great flavors to choose from. with dark roasts like Omen and Nightmare Fuel to medium roasts like Clairvoyant and Wiccan. They've even got a Seance decaf and a Shadow Jack pumpkin spice. You can't go wrong with paranormal coffee. And hey, tell 'em Murder Coaster Podcast sent ya. And now, back to the show.
Chapter 11. Santa Cruz, California, Murderville, USA. Ellen Marie Hansen had dreamed of being a writer since she was 10 years old and filled notebooks with her poetry. She was a sophomore at UC Davis. The lively 20-year-old skydived and loved to hike and was a rugged outdoors person.
But Ellen's boyfriend, Stephen Russell, had never been camping before. So on March 29th, 1981, Ellen decided to take Steve camping for the first time, choosing where the redwoods meet the Pacific Ocean in beautiful Santa Cruz, California.
They leisurely drove the 2.5 hours from Davis, headed to the beach first, to the boardwalk, playing games in the arcade, then locked the keys in their car. But it was all fun. They were young and in love and had their whole lives ahead of them.
They then went to Henry Cowell Redwood Park and set up camp, admiring the huge and famous trees, like the Neckbreaker, 285 feet tall and 51 feet in circumference.
They hiked out to the Cathedral Grove, a ring of redwoods growing from the same base, so majestic as to be church-like. It was then they thought they heard footsteps from somewhere behind them, as well as grumbling and cursing in the shadows and underbrush.
As they cruised down the fern-lined path, beneath overarching branches of the ancient trees, they passed a peculiar man who hurried past them. He looked disgruntled, angry. He had on a baseball hat and thick glasses, a yellow jacket, and a backpack.
A little while later, they saw the man again, coming towards them, striding up and saying very calmly, without the trace of a stutter,
"Oh, so we meet again."
The man then whipped out a revolver and held it on the couple, saying,
"Do what I say, and you won't get hurt."
Steve began pleading, pulling out his wallet and saying, "Here, man, take all our money, it's cool."
The man chillingly said to Stephen with a clear and steady voice, "I'm not here to rob you. I'm here to rape your girlfriend."
As Stephen continued pleading, the man directed them to walk off the path and head through the bushes into the depths of the forest. But Ellen refused, saying, "No, don't go, Stephen. He's just going to kill us anyway."
The gunman barked at them, "Go down the trail. Do what I say. I just want to rape her."
Defiant, angry, Ellen actually stepped toward the man, holding her hands out like she was going to grab the gun. The gunman took a step back, and at the same time, Steve stumbled off the edge of the path and started falling.
The gunman then turned his gun to Steve and squeezed off a round which went through Steve's neck, cutting the main artery in his right arm and coming to a stop up in his sternum, knocking him unconscious.
The Trailside Killer then coldly shot Ellen twice in the abdomen, knocking her to the ground. Then strode up and, standing above her, shot the lively, vibrant, promising young college student with her whole life before her in the head, killing her instantly.
David Carpenter then disappeared into the shadows of the ancient trees.
Steve awoke lying face down in the duff, Ellen beside him, her head in a deep puddle of blood. He reached out, tried to cradle her head, help her somehow, covering himself in blood in the process. Then, realizing it was too late, that she was dead, struggled to his feet and staggered off, searching for help.
Steve, clutching the bullet wound on his neck, went loping down the trail, howling for help the best he could as he gurgled up blood, finally encountering a man and his son, Lee and Ken Fritz, who loaded him into their van and drove him to the ranger station.
Driving to the station, Stephen described the man who'd shot him, and Lee and Ken said they knew exactly who he was talking about. They'd had a conversation with the guy, an older guy in his 50s, baseball cap, balding, wearing a yellow jacket with an Olympic beer drinking club logo on the back.
And then, lo and behold, the guy passes them. They look right at him, a bald guy with wild eyes driving a small red car with a bent exhaust pipe.
And then the killer, after racing out of the park, completely flustered, attempting to get onto Highway 17, accidentally pulled into a cul-de-sac before quickly doing a U-turn.
What an idiot. Ed Kemper never would have done that. But sitting on a curb in that cul-de-sac was a little girl named Melissa, who watched the car come swerving in and clearly saw the man behind the wheel, whom she described as bald and sweating. And guess what? Little Melissa, she happened to love cars. She knew all about them. When questioned by the police, she drew the car perfectly from memory, a boxy sedan with 4 doors, saying she thought it was most likely a Fiat.
Detectives drove the little girl to a Fiat dealership, and she looked through their books, picking out the exact car and color. A statewide search was ordered for a red Fiat with a bent exhaust pipe.
The heat is on.
Chapter 12. Heather. Heather Skaggs was a young graphic design artist going to art school in San Jose. Right next to the school was a quick print shop where she would work when not studying. She had an old blue Volkswagen Bug, which she loved, and the thing had finally completely quit on her. She had no car and desperately needed a vehicle to get from home to school and work. But there was a friendly coworker who told her he had a friend who was selling his Volkswagen Bug and would give her a good deal. She could even owe him if she promised to pay it back.
This coworker seemed like a sweet guy, even if he was a little weird and nerdy, with thick glasses and bald. He had a terrible stutter, which made her feel sorry for him. His name, of course, was David Carpenter. And David Carpenter assured her if she drove down to Santa Cruz with him, he'd get her a new car.
Again, reminder. David Carpenter's parole officer had sent a letter to the quick print shop warning them not to have David working with women. So they put him in an office with this beautiful young girl.
And I know we say beautiful a lot, but Heather Skaggs was really, truly beautiful. I mean, like breathtaking. A California girl with sun-kissed blonde hair, blue eyes. She could have been a model.
Heather's boyfriend, Dan Pingle, did not want her going with this strange man. Neither did her mother, but Heather really wanted that car, needed that car, and figured she'd be safe with the nerdy old man. But she was wary enough to tell her boyfriend, if you don't hear from me by 7 o'clock, call the police, and gave him David Carpenter's name, phone number, and address.
On the morning of Saturday, May 2nd, 1981, Heather went to the Shop and Go Mart, where she was supposed to meet David Carpenter. The cashier remembered her coming in. She then walked out the door and was never seen alive again.
When 7 p.m. rolled around and Heather wasn't back yet, her boyfriend Dan called the number she'd left.
David's mother answered and said, "No, David wasn't there. He'd gone to the ballet." Ugh.
So Heather's boyfriend gets a buddy, and they drive up to San Francisco and sit outside David's house waiting for him to come home. He eventually does. It's late at night, and they're like, "Where the fuck is Heather?"
David starts stuttering, saying he doesn't know, he'd never met her, he'd overslept and wasn't feeling well. He told him it wasn't a definite plan, that he told her he might not show up, and if he didn't, to just go on with her day. He didn't know where she was. He had no idea.
In the morning, Dan went to the police and reported her as the missing person, saying she was supposed to meet this older guy she worked with to go to Santa Cruz and buy a car, a guy named David Carpenter.
At first, law enforcement took a bit of a lackadaisical attitude, thinking the young girl had just run off, but then began to get some pressure when Heather's mom started talking to the press, demanding to know why the cops weren't searching for her daughter. So police started looking into it, and then became very concerned when they saw that this David Carpenter was on parole for violent sex crimes.
Yeah, red flag. So the San Jose police assigned their finest detectives to the case, super cops Ken Womack and Walt Robinson. First, they decided to go to her place of work and interview folks. Her fellow employees say, yeah, it was a little weird the way David would stare at Heather, harp on her. They want to talk to David, but he's not there.
And as detectives Womack and Robinson are leaving, being the super cops that they are, they notice, parked on the far lot, hidden in the back corner behind some other cars, a small red car, a Fiat with a distinctly bent tailpipe, and ask one of the workers about it. The worker says it's David's car, but he doesn't drive it often, mostly uses his green Chevy. He just leaves that red Fiat there.
Bingo! Lights are going off. The detectives contact his parole officer and arrange a meeting with David.
When David showed up for the meeting with his parole officer and the two detectives, he'd grown a beard and was not wearing glasses, which struck his parole officer as very odd, as it appeared he was trying to hide his appearance.
When the detectives begin to question him, he starts to stutter so badly that his body actually contorted, and the investigator thought he was having a seizure. It's a bizarre interview. David can barely answer a question. But then, for some reason, he began talking about his mother, how she was domineering and how she made him take ballet lessons as a child, which he despised. As he's rambling about his hatred for his mother, he suddenly stops stuttering and is now speaking perfectly, ranting.
The investigators are staring at him open-jawed. His parole officer had never seen him like this before and was just like, what the fuck?
David, sensing all this, says,
What? You don't believe me?
Then David Carpenter leaps up and starts doing ballet, dancing about the room, demonstrating pirouettes and pliés. Womack and Robinson, elite detectives who thought they'd seen it all, were stunned by the bizarre performance. Then David sat back down, and when they began to ask him more questions, again the stutter returned.
When the investigators were leaving, David says to them, I pray to God they find her body and that she was not raped. A statement which just blew the detectives' minds. Why would he say that? She was just a missing person at this point. She could be down in San Diego surfing, for anyone knew. She could be at a Grateful Dead concert or something. No one had implied she was dead, much less raped.
The statement was the deal breaker for the super cops. Though they had no evidence, no way to prove it, both detectives were positive that David Carpenter not only murdered Heather Skaggs, but was the Trailside Killer as well.
And it was the weekend, and the Trailside Killer always attacked on the weekend. Womack and Robinson started making calls. This guy had to be put under surveillance. They alerted the Trailside Killer Task Force. They called Detectives Stony Brook and Santa Cruz. They even called the FBI. No one was getting killed under their watch. It ended here.
Chapter 13. Surveillance.
David Carpenter was then put on a surveillance like no other. This is crazy. So obviously, the San Jose police are trailing him, but now detectives from the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Department come up, police from the Marin County Trailside Killer Task Force, the San Francisco Police Department gets involved, the California Highway Patrol, and the FBI. They're all trailing this guy, and the FBI is even using an airplane to track his car, which they've put a tracking device on.
Meanwhile, detectives go and interview Candy, who'd recently moved out of the house.
Aw, I thought it was true love. I really thought that relationship was meant to last.
Yeah, what could have gone wrong? The detectives later described Candy as a, quote, wild free spirit, end quote. They end up taking her to the hotel, which all the cops and feds had taken over, and she swims in the pool and struts around topless. But while interviewing her, she mentions he took something from her that really pissed her off. A jacket she liked. A very cool, glittery gold jacket that said Olympic Beer Drinking Team. Billings, Montana, on the back. Bingo.
And that was really all they needed. One strong piece of evidence tying David to the case. So law enforcement went to a judge and secured a warrant at 5 a.m. And by dawn, his parents' little house was surrounded by undercover cops from all over California and the FBI. There was a SWAT team hidden in a nondescript van. And at 7:30, out strolls David, heading to his car.
Law enforcement decided to let Santa Cruz detective Stony Brook have the honors, strolling up to him and introducing himself, saying he wanted to discuss some murders that happened in the redwoods.
When David said he had nothing to say to him, Detective Stony Brook, and what a name, Detective Stony Brook, maybe that's why they let him arrest him. Well, old Stony Brook shoved him up against the garage door and slapped the cuffs on him as FBI agents and cops descended from everywhere.
David Carpenter stared open-mouthed and bug-eyed at the droves of law enforcement and whispered to the Santa Cruz detective, "Please don't hurt me. I've always been a model inmate."
What a pathetic thing to say. Later, at his arraignment, David Carpenter stuttered so badly he couldn't even speak his own name.
In David's house, they found hiking maps for Marin and Santa Cruz. But they couldn't find the gun. They really needed that weapon if they wanted to guarantee a conviction.
On May 24th, 1981, in Big Basin State Park in Santa Cruz, hikers found the badly decomposed, naked body of Heather Skaggs deep in the redwoods.
She'd been buried, hidden behind a huge redwood log, covered in brush, but animals had pulled her free from her shallow grave, as if to expose a terrible, terrible secret.
She'd been sexually assaulted and shot in the face, right below the right eye.
And then, the gun turns up. In the craziest of ways. This is just wild, wild, wild.
So remember David's old friend Shane from when he was in federal prison, the bank robber that for some reason looked up to him? This guy, I tell you, what a character. We could do a podcast just on this guy. Well, old Shane is still robbing banks, and he's on the run with his girlfriend, and they'd gone totally punk rock. Shane's got a mohawk. His girlfriend has bleached platinum hair with jet black streaks, an awesome look. They're going to punk shows in San Fran and robbing banks to pay for their heroin habit.
He'd just walk up to a teller in a bank, discreetly flash what he said was a gun, which usually wasn't, and ask for all the hundreds, which was usually less than $1,000, then quickly walk out and hop on a city bus. They did it constantly. Once a security guard ran after him and his hunker girlfriend clobbered the guy and got into a fist fight with him while Shane hopped on the bus.
Well, Shane told his old buddy, David Carpenter, whom for some reason looked up to him, I don't know why, that he needed a real gun if he was going to rob the banks, that his fake guns weren't working. And Carpenter had given him the .38 to use in a bank robbery, probably figuring that Shane would get killed or get caught. And either way, it would look like Shane was the Trailside Killer. But after David was arrested for being the Trailside Killer, Shane figured out that he was being set up. So he wrapped the gun up and hid it.
Then Shane got caught robbing a bank in Los Angeles, and he tells the cops, "Work with me, give me a break, cut me a deal, and I'll tell you where the Trailside Killer's gun is." And he did just that, wrapped in paper and hidden in the rubble of an abandoned gas station in San Francisco.
David Carpenter's goose was fully cooked.
Chapter 14. The Trial. David was to have two trials, one for the murders of Ellen Hansen and Heather Skaggs in Santa Cruz, and one for the murders of Richard Stowers, Cynthia Moreland, Shauna May, Diane O'Connell, and Ann Alderson in Marin County.
The first trial was in Santa Cruz, and David pled not guilty. But the evidence was so overwhelming that during the closing arguments, his lawyer actually admitted his guilt and threw David on the mercy of the court, hoping to escape the death penalty, which had been reinstated in California since our last Santa Cruz killers.
But the jury showed no mercy, and David was given the death penalty, sentencing him to be executed in the gas chamber of San Quentin.
And then the Marin trial, during which David took the stand in his own defense, stuttering away, putting calendars and notebooks into evidence that he says proved he couldn't possibly be the dreaded Trailside Killer. But he was quickly found guilty and sentenced to death yet again.
But by now, after the two lengthy trials, it was 1988, and the automatic appeals process began. In 1995, the Santa Cruz convictions were overturned due to jury misconduct. The California Supreme Court later reinstated the Santa Cruz convictions.
Somehow, David Carpenter was able to slip through until California put a moratorium on the death penalty.
David Joseph Carpenter, the Trailside Killer, is still alive, and at 94 years old is the oldest person on death row.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of our ongoing series on Santa Cruz, California, murder capital of the world. Whew, what a trip, man. But, we're going to eventually have a very special bonus episode that you're going to love.
We hope you enjoyed this series on Santa Cruz, California, murder capital of the world.
Oh man, I hate this guy so much.
How far away are you from? So he's in San Quentin now?
Yep.
How far away are you from there?
About 3 hours, 3.5 hours.
I think you should go talk to him.
I don't want to talk to that asshole. Fuck him, dude. I probably wouldn't be able to understand what he was saying. I wanted to do a stuttering thing, but I thought that would be rude because I don't want to be ableist and shit. Yeah. But I don't know. There's something about this guy I just despise so much. San Quentin's right north of San Francisco, Marin County, right there. They call it Ballsack Beach because it's right on the bay.
Wow. Okay. I just didn't know if you were gonna go Jillian Lauren on us and go find some cold cases. Do they think they know all of the ones that this guy has done at this point?
No.
Yeah.
No. He's probably linked to other ones. He still denies his guilt to this day. He's saying he didn't do it.
Wow.
Right now, he's like, I'm innocent. 94.
That's
I don't.
wild.
I mean, I've thought. I think it's neat when people. I mean, I don't know if neat is the right word, but I'm friends with a lot of people who correspond with serial killers and collect paintings, and I don't know. I'd love to have a John Wayne Gacy painting or something. And I think it's kind of neat, and I've been tempted to do it, but I don't know, just something. For me personally, I just don't want to go there. It's just too grimy. I don't feel like talking to these assholes.
Yeah. Who was the person you were most tempted to do?
Oh, well, of course, Charlie Manson when he was alive. I would have.
Right.
Which I'm almost kicking myself for. And I also when I first heard about Gypsy or Rose Blanchard, I almost wrote her way back before the case was even famous when it first broke. And I kind of wish I had done that because she's not a serial killer or anything, you know what I mean? And I don't know. And then there's this there's I don't know. I'm just not gonna do that.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Right. You ever been tempted to correspond with a serial killer?
No. I mean, no. Because I have no interest in writing to one and wasting my time doing that. I do kind of think, right, there's something a little bit intriguing about the whole Clarice Starling, Hannibal, to talk face to face to somebody that horrific and vicious. There's a grim, weird fascination with what that might be like. But at the same time, I don't have a death wish. So I don't really want to be anywhere near somebody that probably wants to rape and murder and eat my eyeballs. So no, I'm good. Plus, I don't think I feel like there's no, I never have heard of anybody super cool being in my general. I don't even know what we've got a Rhode Island, there's one major prison in Rhode Island. I don't really even know any of the other places around here. There's no super famous ones in California.
Yeah, we get all the kooks. My friend Bill he wanted to do a podcast about Herbert Mullen and have Edmund Kemper be his co-host, and was actively because they had that weird relationship, Ed Kemper.
Right.
And was he's very actively trying to get in touch with Ed Kemper, who had complete telephone privileges and could have maybe done it over the telephone, but wow. It never happened. And I don't think Ed can speak really well now because of the strokes and shit. But that would have been something. That would have been really weird. Wild.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you so much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. And if you want to reach out to us, you got a case you think we should cover, if we got something wrong, or you got some cool information you think we'd love hearing from you. Just reach out at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. And we will talk to you soon.